The main
Yeah.
topic on Mastering Dungeons this week is the final look at the player's handbook. We're going to go through its appendices. Um, the first appendix is conditions. So, what are conditions and why are they important? So, last week when we talked about the design side of things, we looked at this equation where it said the player's hit points plus the damage that the players can do needed to be greater than the monster hit points and the damage the monsters can do. It's a pretty simple equation. It's much more complex than that, actually. But if you just generalize in that way, right, we want the
Yeah.
damage that the players can do and their hit points to be greater than the other side. So we can have these combats that are tense, but that we know the players will most likely win. So, what do conditions do in this equation? Well, what conditions do is they either make it more or less likely that someone will hit someone else, or they make it impossible for someone to hit someone else by taking away their actions completely. So all of these things, just regardless of what they do, regardless of the riders that they put on, or how detailed or how simple they are, they're really all just little modifiers to this grand equation.
That's a good
Uh,
point. It's interesting.
Thoughts?
Yeah. So it's interesting to look back at editions. And did third edition have a list of conditions? I know fourth did.
I feel like third edition did.
It might have. But, you know,
Boy, we've been
going
around a while.
yeah, going before that, right? These were things that just sort of like periodically would emerge from the game. Like spells would do things like blind you, or something would hold you, a hold person kind of thing. And all of that was very fascinating in that it was, almost like, an individual thing would do an individual effect. But then over time, people would point to that and emulate that. And I'm it's fascinating to try to what the game has tried to do across the editions is to standardize those pieces, right? To try to
Yeah.
allow us to have a common understanding of what the game should do to you, basically, right? It should incapacitate you, right?
Mhm.
Hold you. It should stun you, knock you prone, and that should mean the same thing every time. Versus be that one time when you're knocked prone, this is what happens, and another time when you're knocked prone, it's really pushed over, and it's an entirely different thing, right? What are you finding in third edition?
Yeah. I am finding in third edition that I don't see a list of conditions that is
Mm,
pulled out like it is in fourth and fifth, but there are definitely things that can happen in various ways. They're basically conditions without calling them
hmm
conditions.
To me, it's
Like
fourth
I
where it
see
really comes.
cowering
Yeah. Okay. Huh.
and unconscious and prone and I already said cowering, right?
Mhm.
So all of those things are here,
Cowering. I forgot
but
about
they're
that one.
not as discreetly stunned is something that you could have
Yeah,
been
done for
in
sure.
third
Yeah, I
edition.
remember that. Yeah, so that's really
So
interesting.
the answer is absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, it existed, just maybe had not become quite as formalized. It's getting there. And I know fourth and fifth, both have had all these like, condition cards, right, that DMs would have, and you just hand it to a player and say, "This is what you're going through," right? Like, fascinating.
Mhm. The little plastic tops to soda pop bottles became highly coveted in third edition because each cut that you would take the white one and that would be blessed, and
Yeah.
then you'd take the red one and this would be on fire, and you would take the blue one and that would be stunned, and you would
Well,
put them on your minis to
yeah,
yeah.
and that makes me, I use Goody's hairbands, but the that makes me
Mhm.
think of the fact that one of the reasons fourth edition had so many of those little condition bands was that also they had a sort of condition, which was that the ongoing save ends,
Mhm.
right? That was a thing that really demanded tracking, right? You are on fire, you're going to take fire damage at the start of your turn, or you're marked, or any of those sort of things. And so there was a lot more of that sort of on off tracking that really required some way to, whether it was Aaliyah tools or hairbands or pop bottle tops,
Mhm.
any of that. It was really critical to track that, which is fascinating. And that's been simplified a bit right
Mhm.
here. So you don't quite have to do that. Sometimes you will see DMs do this still to mark the characters what they have, or things like there's some things that don't show up here that arguably could, like I'm concentrating. right? The game tends to
Sure.
avoid those things, and as you said, tends to focus on things that are uh, really being done to you, kind of placed upon you, rather than you are self-choosing, which is interesting. Right? There's no
Yeah.
stealth or
So,
things like that. Yeah.
right, exactly. There's invisible, but not hiding,
Mm-hmm.
uh, as a condition. So you're right in that sense where it's, these things that are sort of larger, not temporary like hiding, but
Mm-hmm.
more ingrained in the game. So we put all these conditions here and what they do. It really is telling that they tried to simplify, yet it's still not simple
No, it's a long list.
because right, it's a long list, and if you ask someone, even someone who plays a lot, who maybe doesn't play a character that does these conditions to other people, like what the difference between stunned and incapacitated is,
Mm-hmm.
or poisoned and blinded,
Restrained or yeah,
and
blind.
what it
Yeah.
actually what it actually means, not in terms of what's going on in the story, but what it means mechanically.
Yeah.
Uh, so, something like, what was I looking at? Invisible. You can't be seen without magic or special senses. You're heavily obscured. Your location cannot be detected or can still be detected by noise or tracks, but it leaves out smell.
Hmm.
So technically you could still, even though you're invisible, you could still be detected by something with keen senses, like a wolf that relies on smell. Uh, Disadvantage: if you are invisible, you have disadvantage. Disadvantage to attack invisible creatures, but invisible creatures have advantage to hit. So, what if you're an invisible spellcaster casting an area of effect spell? Should that not give you some sort of advantage? When does the fireball that erupts from an invisible caster actually appear, and why is that not less,
Yeah.
more likely to hurt someone than if someone was shooting an arrow? Right. So we can really get into any or all of these and break them down in terms of
Yeah.
mechanics versus story versus, do we need all of them where there's overlap? uh, would it be a better game if we just had sort of three different conditions?
Mm.
One that makes it advantage to hit you, uh, one that,
Yeah.
we could debate over it, but
Right. Right.
it's an interesting game design and mechanical issue to grapple with. And speaking of grappling,
Grapple. Uh-huh.
grappled. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, switching to the Divine Appendix B. This is, it's a fascinating thing because in previous editions, this would sort of tend to be maybe a multiverse picture like we get later, but deities I
Mhm.
thought were sort of stronger within the whole of the text, like sort of a bigger part. And maybe it reflects our larger society's changes. But here we get an appendix that really says, hey, the gods are so very important to every day, but they're in the appendix.
Mhm.
Um, and we're told
Yeah.
about pantheons, and every setting has
Mhm.
one or more pantheons, and we're then given examples. Forgotten Realms has over 30 deities. Greyhawk has at least 4 or more different human pantheons, where each pantheon represents the ethnic
Yeah.
diversity and physical separation across the ages, right? So, like in Greyhawk, you have
Yeah.
Pelor and Foltest that are both sun gods for different peoples. And so that's really
Right.
fascinating, right?
But
And
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but there are also Sul and Iridian and Flan and Baklunish and Tuv and Olman
Um,
gods. They're all humans, so they're all different pantheons. Then you add to that the non-human creatures, right? The elves have their own pantheons, dwarves, halflings, gnomes. Then you get to giants who all have their own pantheons, and then the undersea creatures, and it just goes on and on and
uh,
on, which is why I think it's in the appendix.
yeah, because otherwise it's a bunch of blibble poop.
Yeah, exactly. That is the god of the, is it Kuatoa?
Yeah, I think.
Uh, I think so. It is a whole thing, but the thing that's important, I think, for me is that we as storytellers love creation myths. We love backstories to our campaigns. We love this nice, sturdy lattice work of concepts that we build our stories on. It
Mhm.
gives us a focus and it brings it all together with a nice, tidy bow. However, the players, they don't necessarily care. I would go as far as saying most players don't care about your particular pantheon and what that means, or your network of gods. I know it's so sad. Uh, what they want to know is, how does it affect me and what my character can see, what they can do, what they can change in this story. So, what I think this appendix tries to do without saying what it tries to do is to say to the players, listen, your DM is going to have their own origin myths, their own gods. They may make their own, they may use some of these. They're important. So we want you to
Mhm.
understand why your DM wants you to care about this. So here's some ways in which they may be important. Keep them in mind, but listen to your DM, because your DM is going to be the one that hopefully brings all this and puts it in front of you in a way that's exciting and that's engaging.
And I love what you're saying. I feel like the game, the edition, is underselling deities and these creation myths and the fun of it. And I know that, for me as a kid, having read Greek mythology and thought, it was amazing and all of that, like I wanted to have those kinds of elements. I was ready for that, very receptive to this concept of playing in sort of mythic worlds. And so D&D seemed to have that to me kind of throughout the work of it. And at the very least, I'd like this place to say, yes, here you can do this. Here's how to do this. Here's what to expect from the world. Here's how to interact with that. Here's how to make the most of it. But I honestly would also like it at each class or even at the species level, right? To tell me more about how to make this a cool part of the story if I want to, because I mean, we're talking about a world shaped by deities where deities can walk the setting and shape it all the time. Like, how would that not be like enormous, right? Like, don't pray at your own
Right.
risk, right? Like, it's so huge, and so we downplay it,
Yeah.
I think, too much for where it should be for most settings, and putting it in the appendix, I think, downplays it unless probably regardless, but at the very least, give it more of a like help the player understand what to do with this. I think, and how to play off of what the DM's doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I said this outright when I just rambled on there for a while, but I think it does belong in the Dungeon Master's Guide
Mm,
because the Dungeon Master is going to use it in so many different ways. Um, like I said, the Dungeon Master is the one that has to make the players care about this stuff. So I am totally behind. Heck, have another Deities and Demigods book. Yeah, that book was loved
yeah.
by first edition players and DMs. Now, I
Mm,
read that book and then I went to college and I took a Greek and Roman mythology class as a freshman that mostly seniors were in. I didn't even We read Ovid and we read Hesiod, and I knew most of it from the Deities and Demigods first edition book, and it was wonderful. I mean,
yeah.
it was informative, it was engaging, but it still comes down to the game master being able to do that. And the game does need to explain it. I don't think it needs to explain it in the player's handbook.
Yeah.
Because if you say how important gods aren't important in my game.
Mm,
And maybe even there aren't any. Uh, and so, yeah, you have a domain, but that doesn't come back to any god. So, no, you don't need to pray every day
and
to when you leave the
yeah,
room to
right.
get out safely.
And that's interesting, to compare against, say, 13th Age, where 13th Age takes these um different groups. They're largely deities, but not solely so, but they're sort of powers in the world. And there is both a die that you roll to determine sort of how things can shape towards one faction or another, but also your character is aligned with certain ones and has enmities or friendships towards others. And that means that there's constant interplay in the world, or at least there can be. It's suggested that there be this
Mhm.
interplay constantly between the different forces. And if I go back and read things like, say, Temple of Elemental Evil, there's this constant infusion of the gods, right? Of Saint Cuthbert, of
Mhm.
the temple, the cult of elemental evil, and what it actually
Ayus.
represents, and Ayuz and Lolth, and all these little bits and pieces, and they're all coming together in really fascinating ways that enrich that
Mhm.
story. And I think we're losing that a bit. And so I would take a lot of this material, chuck it into the DMG as you said, but put instead in the
Mhm.
player's handbook the sort of the instruction manual on how to use what you're going to get out of the setting, right? The setting will have these kinds of things probably, or you can bring this into the setting.
Let's see, what do we have next? We have Appendix C, the planes of existence. So what do we have? We have the material plane. This is where we all exist in our nice, happy little worlds, whether it's Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Eberron. And echoing this material plane are two realms, the Feywild and the Shadowfell. They occupy the same space, but they are sort of distillations of what we go through in the real world. So the Feywild is positive energy, the realm of fairy. The Shadowfell is the plane of shadow, of darkness, of death. And they, when you enter them, present you with this sort of distilled and distorted version of the world that you're used to, your material world.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And really interesting given that you then have the positive and negative planes that sit like a two-sided dome over the other planes, one being radiant, one being necrotic. And we do so little with the positive negative planes and haven't done much with them throughout D&D's history because they're sort of so absolute that if you go there, you either like explode with life or are drained into a undead husk. And so it's almost like, well, why do we even have that exist? Because it's so like I wonder if these
Mhm.
concepts should be merged.
Yeah, I feel like they are. I feel like we started with in first edition sort of the positive and the negative planes, but as you said, they were basically uninhabitable.
Hmm.
So since we need places where the players can actually be and interact with, let's make the Feywild and the Shadowfell these things, and that becomes these neat places where you can actually explore and tell different stories and have different mechanics taking part in the game.
Yeah, so then we hear a little bit about beyond this material plane, and that concept of material plane, is fairly changed. Where the idea of one prime versus many primes, now it's sort of the material just covers all of those settings. We just call it the material plane, and then going beyond that, we're told that is a mythic destination, a legendary journey. You can use spells like plane shift or gate or portal to get there. And we have two transitive planes, the ethereal and astral, and spells can help you cross into these. We're told the ethereal plane is a misty, foggy realm like an ocean. Its shores are the border ethereal, overlapping the material plane and inner planes. And every location in the material or inner planes is overlapped by the border ethereal. So, sort of that similar Feywild Shadowfell concept, but now as a sort of shore along this ethereal sea. And then we have another sea, the astral plane, which is the realm of thought and dream. And here you can travel as this embodied soul to reach the outer planes beyond. So there's sort of gateways to the inner and outer planes, which is super interesting. And the astral plane has swirling wisps and floating earth motes and whirlpools of color. Very interesting.
Mhm. Yep. So the inner planes then are the four elemental planes, the plane of air, earth, fire, and water. They form a ring around the material, and they are suspended within the elemental chaos. These elements combine and appear like worlds that we may be familiar with. And then further away from the proximity to the material world, they turn into areas of the pure element. So at the furthest point, they become then the elemental chaos. So you might be able to go to the city of brass on um, the air elemental plane, or is it fire?
Fire, fire.
Fire, thank you, fire elemental plane, right? And buy strange and exotic things from Ifrit or fire salamanders.
And I like this
But the
as
further away you get, you will just be burned to a
yeah,
husk.
yeah. And I like that as a nice compromise because sometimes when you read like the original manual of the planes, it was sort of like when you travel the plane of elemental Earth, you might just show up in the middle of Earth and you're dead because you can't breathe because you're just entombed. Roll on
Yeah,
this table to determine whether that happens, unless you happen to specifically have a safe gate or something like that. You've been there before,
right.
and so this takes you into gives you some a nice variation, right? You can be closer to the nexus point and have the that it looks a little more like a normal world, but maybe canyons and stuff like that, or you can go all the way to the raw elemental chaos and, and be entombed in earth if you really want that experience.
Yeah. So it's always, it exfoliates. The outer planes then are the divine planes where the deities live. They're often concepts that change on the whims of the powers that dwell there. The upper planes are generally of good alignment or always a good alignment. The lower planes are of the evil alignment. And in the middle, you get various grades of neutrality between good and evil, law and chaos. The distance is meaningless and malleable for the most part. You might traverse the 9 hells in a single day or take a week to cross a single layer. We saw that with Descent into
Descent. Yeah.
Avernus. Yes. What
Yeah.
about some other planes out there?
Yeah, we get to a table with the 16 most well-known planes, which is a nice way to say, there can be many others. But those 16 correspond to the 8 alignments excluding neutrality. And that's because neutrality takes us to sort of sigil and the outlands. So the outlands are a place between the outer planes. This is like a circular structure, like a great wheel. You have 16 gate towns that are settlements built around a portal to one of the outer planes. So you know that you can always go to that one place. If you're a planar traveler, you can always go to that one town and go to that place. And that town, and we talked about some of these towns when we were reviewing a Planescape product not too long ago, but each of them is sort of supposed to capture the feel of that plane in terms of what its temperament, its alignment is like. And then at the center is this spire shooting impossibly high into the sky. And above those, that point of this spire is the ring-shaped, torus-shaped city of Sigil, the city of doors. And this is a bustling metropolis, countless portals to other worlds, and trade all across the plains. And everybody can meet there and do things. Fascinating place, which perhaps we'll see in the Planescape product when it comes out.
Yes, I'm sure we will. Now, there are some planes called demiplanes. These are small extra-dimensional spaces with their own unique rules created by spells or by powerful beings. Some might be natural, some might be temporary. Demiplanes, I tell you, game masters, are your best friend because you can tailor them to do anything that you need your story or adventure to do. So you don't have to worry about, oh, in Descent into Avernus, it said that, the first plane of the 9 hells was this, and this always happened. You can just say, well, I'm going to make a demi-plane because I want some of that, but I also want this to this other thing to happen. So I'm going to make a demi-plane. Just be sure that when you do make your demi-plane, you give your players the opportunity to experience these things and understand these things and come to know these things, because they will appreciate it more rather than having you just spring some sort of nasty surprise on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have the Far Realm, which is beyond the known multiverse. And this is almost the opposite of demiplanes. If demiplanes are those super accessible, have fun with this as a DM, tinker all you want, toy all you want. The Far Realm is sort of like, you can't really touch this because it's so beyond our known multiverse and so tainted, so corrupt, that really what you do to play with it is express how energies or elements or sources are leaking into the prime or other planes, the material plane or other planes, warping them. So there tend to be no known portals.
Yeah.
The few that have existed have disappeared. And, any intrusion is really the subject of adventure.
The problem with running games that touch on the unknowable and the unimaginable is that your players can't know or imagine them. And as soon as they do know or imagine them, they are no longer unknowable or unimaginable. So that's why the far realm is left to be where things come from and not where you go to.
Yeah. If
Right,
you
go
want
ahead.
that kind of like an experience, then you're better off going with a demi-plane, the way that Ravenloft does, right? Because you can give examples of sort of that tainting nature without being the absolute that one can't imagine.
Yep. Appendix D gives us creature statistics. So these are the statistics that druids will use when transforming into animals or getting animal companions. Creatures that serve as familiars will come from this list. Undead that you create via certain spells in D&D will come from this list. So this is just there because it's things that are in the monster manual, but players also need to access them. So here they are in the player's handbook.
And you know what I like about this is that when you look at this sort of stuff as a new player, it might inspire you to become a DM.
At least understanding what the DM is going through, what the DM sees when they're running their
Yeah.
part of the game.
All right, our
And the
final
final
appendix.
appendix is
Woo!
Inspirational Reading. The first edition Dungeon Master's Guide had a long list of inspirations for the game, and the Appendix E here in the player's handbook has some of those same, plus a bunch more that that the team used, more diverse authors, more diverse set of authors. But I'm sure there are shows out there, podcasts out there that go through this one by one and
Oh, yeah.
read them and discuss them. But we all draw inspiration for our games from different things, and this is as good a list as any if you want to start by looking into what some of the creators of this edition of D&D have drawn inspiration from.
Yeah. So, Shawn, looking back on this, I mean, the fifth edition player's handbook has to be one of the better ones out there, right? I mean, it is, as much as we've applied a lot of critique to it, I mean, it is really an exceptional player's handbook, right? And for all of the reasons we've talked about this series, but it is worth stopping and pausing, kind of acknowledging that like this is a really well crafted book. Other than the table, well, not the table of contents, the page numbers, the what do you call that? The page numbers are a bit of a disaster at the end.
Index?
The index, but but it really it has so much to it, and I think there was an approach to how it was crafted that really has worked well and helped this game. And if I think of which core book resulted in this edition being a success, this is the book of the three that I would pick, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can tell that this edition was built through constant feedback from the larger audience, that it took instruction, that it took direction from people who have been playing since first edition days to people who just came in with fourth edition and wanted to see parts of their game get brought forth into the new edition. You can tell that was one of the building blocks of this particular book.
Yeah, and then speaking to some of those
All right.
designers, I heard that too, right? That the goals, one of the biggest goals was this accessibility, this appeal to both a new person who's never seen it and to someone who's played with any of those previous editions, right? And they do that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So now we're asking you again, where do you want us to go from here? Continue with the 5e books, Dungeon Master's Guide? Start looking at other games, start looking at other adventures, start looking at something else completely. We want to know what you want. So you can let us know. You can let us know through a variety of ways. You can become a patron of the show to talk to us directly. And thank you to the patrons who are out there right now. Thank you to our Masters of Dungeon supporters. A special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters who get their names in our show notes. And thank you to our Masters of the Multiverse patrons. we're going to talk about you right now, John Wilson, Graham Ward, James Walton, Joe Tyler, Krishna Simone Say, Chance Russo at Dragon Russo, Falcon Neal, the Micro Ant, Eric Mengi, Adrian Marquez at Post Fiction RPG Audio, Travis Lee, Brian King, Shawn Hurst, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Andy Edmonds at the Nerdronomicon, Robin Dermy, Darren Chandler, Evil John, Steve Bissonette, and Craig Bailey. Thank you so much for being masters of this multiverse. You can also talk to us via other methods, such as going to our, of course, our Patreon. You can also go to Apple Podcast and leave a review and let us know what you're thinking. You can also subscribe via YouTube to see our beautiful faces and leave us some comments. So, Teos, where can people find you and your work?
Find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can reach my YouTube and other efforts on Mastodon at alphastream at dice.camp. Twitter, I mainly use it to send stuff out because the third-party app support is gone, so I can't easily look at tweets. What about you, Shawn? Where do we find you?
You can still find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, or the podcast on Twitter at MasteringDND. I am also on Mastodon, as is the podcast. The podcast is at dice.camp, and I am at tabletop.social as Shawn Merwin. And you can, of course, always go to the YouTube channel where you can see our beautiful faces. So, Teos, we just got through the 5e Player's Handbook. What are we going to do now?
Go to the demiplane of rest.
Go to the demiplane of bourbon.
No, kids, don't do that.